بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So inshallah bi'idhnillah, to continue with Kitab Asrar al-Tahara, so that which the purposes, the reasons, the hidden meanings behind the Tahara, etc. And we stopped last week at al-Qism al-Awwal fi Taharat al-Khabath. So we took the introduction, although it was a very abridged and summarized introduction in comparison to the original. So the original version, the introduction is far greater, and there are some points perhaps that we might touch upon this evening in relation to some of the points mentioned in the original introduction, which are important for us to consider when they come up, inshallah. So he says, Al-Qism al-Awwal, the first section, fi Taharat al-Khabath. So if you remember last week, we said, فَنَقُولُ, the author, rahimahullah, al-Ghazali, he says, فَنَقُولُ طَهَارَةُ الظَّاهِرِ ثَلَاثَةُ أَقْسَامٍ طَهَارَةٌ عَنِ الْخَبَثِ وَطَهَارَةٌ عَنِ الْحَدَثِ وَطَهَارَةٌ عَنِ فَضْلَاتِ الْبَدَنِ. So he mentions that he's going to focus on the outward acts of purification. So he mentioned the two types of purification in Islam, the inner and the outer, and the outer being, we mentioned that which leads to the inner state of tahara, purification. And the most important part of the purification process in Islam is purification of the heart, purification of the soul. That's the purpose of the acts of worship and so on and so forth. So he says the three types: the first, to rid ourselves, to purify ourselves of the khabath, so the literal tangible impurities. Then the hadath, so the ritual non-tangible states of impurity. And then the third, fadlat al-badan, so that which is excess, considered to be excess from the body, so nails, hair, and so on and so forth. So now he's going to go into the detail of each category. So he says, Al-Qism al-Awwal, the first category. He says, fi taharat al-khabath. And so this is going to entail a level of fiqh. So now he's going to go into the fiqh of tahara. And he is a Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, from the A'immah of the Shafi'iyah. He ascribed to the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i. And so that which he mentions is going to be considered from within the framework of the Shafi'i school. And there are issues which are points of difference, which perhaps will be highlighted, but not necessarily explained, as it's not the purpose behind this class this evening is not a fiqh class, but we want to cover that which the author covers, so we'll go through it anyway, inshallah. And there's a lot to take from it and benefit, and perhaps some haven't studied fiqh before, so this will be like an introduction, how fiqh works. And so to understand fiqh is basically the governing framework of Islam, which relates to all aspects of our lives. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Quran and the Sunnah as sources of revelation. The Prophet ﷺ was a walking example of the Quran, and the Sahaba were those who were instructed by the Prophet ﷺ and those who saw the Prophet ﷺ enact the Quran, and they took notes, they understood it, and they then relayed it to their students, who then relayed it to their students, and this was formulated in what we have today, the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence, starting with Imam Abu Hanifa in Iraq, Imam Malik in Hijaz, Imam al-Shafi'i, which took from both, and then finally Imam Ahmad. And so Imam al-Ghazali, he followed the Shafi'i school. He was raised as a Shafi'i in his fiqh. And so he's going to elaborate. And we mentioned in the beginning that he is a cornerstone for the Shafi'i school. He's a cornerstone for the Shafi'i school. You cannot study the school of Imam al-Shafi'i today except that you will be studying the works of Imam al-Ghazali in one way or another. Either directly, i.e. the direct works of Imam al-Ghazali, his books, his older books, or that which has been abridged and summarized from his works, such as Al-Minhaj by Imam al-Nawawi. And if you were to study the philosophy of Islamic law, regardless which school you study from, you will be studying his book Al-Mustasfa, which was considered to be a revolutionary book in the science of usul al-fiqh. It's considered to be an advanced book, but it's a book which all schools will refer to due to his style of writing, the way he presented it, and so on and so forth. So he says, وَالنَّظْرُ فِيهِ So in order for us to discuss the first category, i.e. purification from literal, physical, tangible impurities, he says we have to look at it from three aspects. The first section, bil-muzal, that which we are ridding, wal-muzal bihi, and that which we are using to rid that which is being removed, wal-izala, and the process of removal. So what does that mean? It will become clear, inshallah. But look at the way that Imam al-Ghazali categorizes and presents in a very easy to understand, easy to digest formula. He says, الطرف الأول في المزال, so that which is to be removed, he says, وهي النجاسة, which is the impurity. So he's going to now discuss impurities. What are to be considered impurities within the framework of Islam, i.e. that which we have to remove from our bodies, our clothing, and the place of prayer prior to praying, prior to performing tawaf, etc. He says, al-a'yan thalatha, there are three types, jamadat wa hayawanat wa ajza'ul hayawanat. So there are three overarching, I should say, categories. Number one, jamadat. So that which you could say is natural and inanimate. So that which is inanimate, natural, that which is not a creature, so as to say. The second category, creatures. So humans and animals, beast and man, etc. The third category, he says, وَأَجْزَاءُ حَيَوَانَات, that which is emitted or that which makes up the parts of the creatures, which will become clearer. So أَجْزَاءُ حَيَوَانَات, for example, he's going to mention hair, teeth, nails. It could be that which is released from the body, bodily fluids, etc. So those are the three areas that he's going to address. He says, أَمَّا الْجَمَادَاتِ, so as for that which is natural, that which is inanimate, he says, فَطَاهِرَةٌ كُلُّهَا, all of the jamadat, everything which is a natural, organic, inanimate object or subject or creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to be considered pure. So he's saying, al-aslu fil ashya at-tahara. That's what he's saying basically. That the essence of that which has been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pure. That's the default state. Unless there is indication to suggest otherwise. And he says, إِلَّا الْخَمَرُ وَكُلُّ مُنْتَبِذٍ مُسْكِرٍ, except for alcohol. Khamar, though, is a particular type of alcohol, that which has been fermented. So that which has been fermented, except for fermented alcohol. And of course, the ulama, they base upon that all other types of alcohols. So whether the alcohol has been fermented, naturally fermented, or it's another process of the alcoholization, etc., all alcohols are considered to be impure. وَكُلُّ مُنْتَبِذٍ مُسْكِرٍ, and everything which has been fermented and becomes alcoholic. Yeah, so or everything which has gone through a process and becomes alcoholic. So anything other than alcohol, and why does he mention alcohol? Because alcohol is a natural process. It's something which naturally occurs. And if you were to take, for example, a fruit and you were to leave it in some water, it will naturally ferment and naturally become alcoholic. So the asl, if I come into contact with something, if I touch something that's natural, organic, then I should assume that it's pure. My first assumption should be that it's impure. Then he says, وَالْحَيَوَانَاتِ طَاهِرَةٌ كُلُّهَا إِلَّا الْكَلْبُ وَالْخِنْزِيرُ وَمَا تَوَلَّدَ مِنْهُمَا أَوْ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمَا. So he says the second category, creatures. So living organisms, animals, humans, etc. He says all of them are pure except for the dog and the pig. So these two animals are considered to be impure. And the ulama, they discuss the nature of the impurity of the dog and the pig, etc. So, for example, if you were to stroke a dog, is that considered to be something which is impure? It makes your hand impure, you need to wash your hand. And the answer is no. That impurity is transferred through the nose, the tongue, so that which is basically wet, moist, liquid, etc. As for something which is dry, impurity is not transferred from something dry to something else which is dry. There's no transfer of impurity in that case. So if a person stroked a dog it's fine. It's not going to break or nullify his wudu. It's not going to mean that his hand is impure, etc. But if a dog licked his hand, then he would need to wash his hand. If a dog licked his thobe or his clothing, he would need to wash that. Why? Because the saliva of the dog is considered to be impure. Then he says, وَالْخِنْزِيرُ وَمَا تَوَلَّدَ مِنْهُمَا أَوْ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمَا. And that which is born from a dog and pig, or one of the two. So anything which is born from a dog or a pig, regardless whether it's a full breed or it's not a full breed, it's considered to be impure. Then he says, فَإِذَا مَاتَتْ فَكُلُّهَا نَجِسَةٌ إِلَّا خَمْسَةٌ. And if any of those, that which has been mentioned, pass away, so all of the creatures, etc., that have been mentioned, organisms, humans, animals, if any of those things pass away, die, then they are considered to be impure, except for 5 things. So he's giving you the general rule, and then he's giving you the exemption. And that's the way that we study. We study the general rule, and then we study the exemption to the general rule. But there's something to understand here when he says, إِذَا مَاتَتْ, if it dies, what he's saying is, if one of these things dies a natural death. Let's say, for example, if you have that which is permissible for us to eat, it's halal. A cow, for example. If a cow dies naturally, it just rolls over and dies, then it becomes impure. But if it dies in a way wherein it's been slaughtered so that its meat can be consumed, then it's not najis, it's not impure. If it was, then we wouldn't be able to eat it. Yeah. So he says, إِلَّا خَمْسَةٌ. So everything, when it dies a natural death, becomes impure except for 5 things. Number 1, al-adami, so man, so humankind, if they die, they remain pure. Muslim and non-Muslim. Muslim and non-Muslim. The Muslim and the non-Muslim are pure in life and in death. Man is pure in life and death. And some have an assumption that the non-Muslim is impure, and that's wrong, that's false. The Prophet ﷺ interacted with non-Muslims, used utensils from non-Muslims, and so on and so forth. The only time where something, the body part or utensil of a non-Muslim would be considered to be impure is if there's an impure substance which has been contained within that utensil. For example, a bowl. Then you would wash the bowl and you can use it. For example, if a non-Muslim has been drinking alcohol and they have alcohol on their lips, then yeah, that's impurity on their lips. But the non-Muslim himself or herself is not impure. Just as a Muslim, if a Muslim drinks alcohol, the alcohol on the lips is impure. So the Muslim and the non-Muslim are pure, i.e. their body, pure. For example, some might say you shouldn't shake the hand of a non-Muslim. Why? They're impure. It's absolute misunderstanding of Islam. It's false understanding. He says, وَالسَّمَكْ, likewise fish. If fish die a natural death, they are considered to be pure. They're not considered to be impure. They're not considered to be impermissible to eat, for example, although the Ahnaf, they do have an exemption for certain types of sea creatures. So if a fish dies a natural death, it's considered pure, it's considered halal, etc. Why? Because it would be impossible to catch a fish and slaughter the fish. How are you going to catch a fish and slaughter the fish? It's not possible. And it's a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the creatures of the sea are halal. Number 3, al-jarad. So crickets, when they die, they don't become impure. Number 4, he says, wadudu tufah. So dood is like, a worm or perhaps a small insect similar to a worm, a caterpillar, etc. He says, dudu tufah, so that which comes from the apple. He says, وَفِي مَعْنَاهُ كُلُّ مَا يَسْتَحِيلُ مِنَ الْأَطْعِمَةِ. So likewise, any creature that is born from food, when it dies, is considered to be pure. So for example, if you leave a certain type of food and you leave it by itself, there will be creatures that are born from the food. And so they're considered to be pure. Why? Because their essence is pure. Their asl is pure. Yeah. So for example, if you eat an apple and you bite into it and there's a worm, the worm's halal. You can consume it if you would like to. If you're drinking a cup of tea and you find something is in the tea, a small type of bug that fits some of the other descriptions that we're going to mention, then you can drink it. It's added protein. And I've heard they're starting to sell protein, bugs for protein now anyway. So وفي معناه من الأطعمة وكل ما ليس له نفس سائلة كالذباب. So every type of insect which doesn't have blood, basically. It doesn't have blood. If it dies, it's not considered to be impure. So if it dies, let's say on your thobe or your hand, he says, فلا ينجس الماء بوقوع شيء منها فيه. So if one of these creatures were to drop into your water, as we mentioned, it wouldn't be something which makes the water impure. A small worm and for us today, it's strange for us to consider eating an apple with a worm in it. But previously, that may have been the norms. Previously, you would have small insects in rice, for example. When you buy rice, you would find small insects in the rice. You would find small insects in fruit, in vegetables, etc. That was considered to be normal for many people, and it's still considered to be normal today. But because we live such a privileged lifestyle in the West, in the Western world, and in the so-called rich parts of the world, we are not accustomed to that. We find it to be repulsive, etc. But for many, that's normal, and it's not something that they wouldn't consider doing. He says, وَأَمَّا أَجْزَاءُ الْحَيَوَانَاتِ فَقِسْمَانِ. So he's spoken about the jamadat, that which is natural, that which comes from the earth, that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, that which has remained in its natural state, organic, etc., all pure, except for that which is alcoholic. Likewise, the hayawanat, creatures, all pure, except for the pig and the dog. And if they die, they become impure. If they die a natural death, they become impure, except for 5. The son of Adam, so man, fish, crickets, bugs or worms that are born from apples, etc., or fruit, vegetables. And he also says, كل ما لا نفس له سائل أو كل ما ليس له نفس سائلة. So that which has no blood, the inner parts of it are not running, they don't run. If you squash them, there's no blood that comes out, etc. And then he goes on to أجزاء الحيوانات. So that which is from the creature or the creatures or the creation, but can be considered separate from, as well as a part of. What does that mean? We're going to have a look. He says, أحدهما ما يقطع منه. So that which is cut from an animal. So if you have something which is cut from an animal, cut from a creature, حكمه حكم الميت. So the ruling for that particular thing is the ruling of the particular creature that it was cut from, if that creature was to die. So what's an example of this? Let's say a person is hunting a sheep. I don't know if you can hunt sheep. It would perhaps not much of a hunt. But let's say there's a wild goat, and a person is hunting the wild goat. If you were to cut, try to hit the sheep and you cut its leg off, what's the ruling of the leg? It's come off the sheep, the goat now. What's the ruling of the goat's leg? It takes the ruling of the goat if the goat were to die a natural death, which is what? Impure. Although some of the fuqaha, the ulama, they make an exemption in this case. Or let's say an easier example, you have a goat and it loses its leg. Its leg drops off through some sort of accident, etc. And you happen to come across this goat's leg. Can you take it home and cook it? No. Why? Because the ruling of the leg is the ruling of the entire body if the entire body were to die a natural death. Yeah. But if we were to look at a fish now, let's say, for example, you're hunting some sort of fish and you try to take it out of the water with a spear or something like that, and you cut a part of the fish off, but the fish swims away. You pull up your spear and there's a large chunk of the fish attached, but the fish managed to swim away. What's the ruling of that chunk of fish? It's halal. Why? It's not impure, it's pure. Why? Because the fish, if it dies a natural death, it becomes what? Pure. Therefore, that which is taken from it in life is considered pure. Yeah, that's in relation to the meat and so on and so forth. But then he speaks about other parts. He says, وَالشَّعْرُ لَا يَنْجُسُ بِالْجَزِّ وَالْمَوْتِ وَالْعَظْمِ يَنْجُسُ. He says, as for the hair, the fur, the hair and the fur, if you take it from the animal in life or death, it's not considered to be impure. Although there is a condition, some of the fuqaha, they discuss, it's that the hair or the fur is cut rather than pulled. Why would they place that condition there, that it's cut, it's shaved rather than pulled? If it hurts the animal, if the animal's dead.
No.
Which part? Exactly, because the hair is rooted in the body. And so if you pull it and you pull the roots of the hair with it, then you're pulling out that which is impure. And so you can take from that which is above the skin, but if you go into the skin itself, then you're pulling up that which is impure. Then he says, الثاني, so the first part of أجزاء الحيوانات, as we mentioned. The second part, الرطوبات الخارجة أو الرطوبات الخارجة من باطنه فكل ما ليس مستحيلا ولا له مقر فهو طاهر. So he says, as for that which comes from the body, so what comes from the body, he's going to mention examples. As for that which comes from the body, and it doesn't have a particular place where it's contained within the body, and it's not something which has changed from something else. Yeah, something which has changed from something else. So as an example, let's see what he mentions first. كالدمع والعرق واللعاب والمخاط وما له مقر وهو مستحيل فنجس. So everything which sorry, one second. فكل ما ليس مستحيلا ولا له مقر فهو طاهر. Yeah. So everything that doesn't have a place within the body and it hasn't changed from something else within the body, it's considered to be pure, such as tears, sweat, lu'ab, so saliva, والمخاط, mucus, etc. He says, وَمَا لَهُ مَقَرْ وَهُوَ مُسْتَحِيلٌ فَنَجِسٌ إِلَّا مَا هُوَ مَادَةُ الْحَيَوَانِ كَالْمَنِي وَالْبَيْضِ. He says, as for that which does have a particular place in the body, and it is something which has changed from something else, then it's considered impure. And he gives examples, but he exempts two things. مَادَةُ الْحَيَوَانِ, that which is, it makes up the essence of the animal, the creation, which is, he mentions, mani, so that which is emitted by man, wal-bayd, and that which is emitted by women, so eggs, etc., from the ovaries. He says, وَالْقَيْحُ وَالدَّمُ وَالرَّوْثُ وَالْبَوْلُ نَجِسٌ. So then he gives an example of that which has a place in the body and it's changed from something into something else, such as al-qayh, so pus. Pus has changed from what into pus? What does pus originate from? Blood. He says, وَالدَّمُ وَالرَّوْثُ. So rawth being food which has been digested and it's changed. Rawth is that which is excreted. Wal-bawl, urine, that which has been digested and changed, etc. نجس من الحيوانات كلها ولا يعفى عن شيء من هذه النجاسات قليلها وكثيرها إلا عن خمسة. So he says all of it is considered to be impure, that which is excreted, that which is emitted from animals, etc., from all creatures, except for 5 things. And he says large amounts of it and small amounts of it are the same. They're all considered to be impure. He says except for 5 things. الأثر بعد الاستجمار يعفى عنه ما لم يعد المخرج. So that which remains when a person uses the bathroom, when they relieve themselves and they use tissue paper, for example, and they don't use water after the tissue paper, there is going to be an amount that they cannot clean, which is only removed with water. So that is overlooked within the Sharia. Although some of the ulama today, they will say that in our case, in our time, after the time of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, that wouldn't be the case. Why? Because they used to eat so little. Whereas since then, people eat so much. The condition is, so long as it doesn't go beyond the place that it has been released from. So without going into the details, I'm sure you can understand what that means, and you can see why the ulama would say in our time today a person must use water. They can't suffice simply with tissue paper or its like. He says, وَطِينُ الشَّوَارِعِ so that which basically attaches itself to your thobe, the abaya, a dress, etc., your shoes, your socks, from the remnants outside on the street. So he says teen is like basically mud. And so they didn't really have cemented roads, etc., as we do today. And within the mud, within the ground, as people were walking on it, it would become mixed and muddied with impurities. So he's saying that this is overlooked in the Sharia. Why? Because it's something which cannot be avoided. He says, وَغُبَارُ الرَّوْثِ فِي الطَّرِيقِ يُعْفَى عَنْهُ مَعَ تَيَقُّنِ النَّجَاسَ بِقَدْرِ مَا يَتَعَذَّرُ الْإِحْتِرَازِ عَنْهُ. So he says, likewise, dust or that which comes from al-rawth, excrement, etc. Let's say, for example, in a street, it's being transferred in the air or something of the like. It's overlooked so long as the person is trying his best to avoid coming into contact with these things. And when trying to avoid coming into contact with these things, it doesn't mean that they're becoming excessive, but they're doing their best in accordance to that which is normal. It doesn't mean they're becoming excessive, where they're developing an OCD, etc. Then he says, وَمَا عَلَى أَسْفَلِ الْخُفِّ مِنْ نَجَاسَةٍ لَا يَخْلُ الطَّرِيقُ عَنْهَا. So likewise, that which is beneath the khuf, and of course we don't walk around with khifaf on in our time today outside, etc. But there were types of the leather socks, as we would call them today, that they would use outside, that which has been stitched with something on the bottom, for example, so they could be walked around in outside. So najasa on the bottom of those was overlooked. It's overlooked in the Sharia. Why? Because it's something which is unavoidable. Then he says, وَدَمُ الْبَرَاغِيثِ, and likewise that which comes from bugs, so the blood of bugs, وَدَمُ الْبَثَرَاتِ, and the water or the blood which is emitted from spots or blisters, that's overlooked. He says, and all of this shows, وَمُسَامَحَةُ الشَّرْعِ فِي هَذِهِ النَّجَاسَاتِ تُعَرِّفُكَ أَنَّ أَمْرَ الطَّهَارَةِ عَلَى التَّسَاهُلِ. He says all of this, the overlooking of the Sharia, shows you that the position of the Sharia when it comes to impurities and so on and so forth, and physical purification of the body, is a position of lenience. A position of lenience. وَمَا ابْتُدِعَ مِنْ وَسْوَسَةٍ لَا أَصْلَ لَهَا. And that which he says was invented of waswasa has no foundation within the Shara. What does he mean by this? He's talking about the fuqaha. Imam al-Ghazali, although he was an Imam from the Aimma of the fuqaha, he's referring here to the excessiveness of the fuqaha when they're speaking about the purity of water, the purity of clothing, the purity of body, the purity of the place of prayer. And Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he also mentions this. He says that the fuqaha, they focus so much on the purity of water and clothing and body, and they forget the purity of the heart. And he says the mutasawwifa, they focus so much on the purity of the heart and the soul, they forget the purity of the body and the clothing and the place of prayer. He says, and the way of the Salaf was to join between the two, purity of the heart and soul, and purity of the body and the clothing and the place of prayer. But based upon the middle path, not too far to one side or too far to the other side. And he goes into detail. He mentions some of the narrations of the Sahaba, some examples of the Sahaba during their time, as mentioned by the Tabi'een, and how easygoing they were when it came to that which, tangible impurities. Doesn't mean that they didn't purify themselves properly, no, but they did not make it excessive the way that it has become excessive in our time today, to the extent that Muslims develop OCDs when it comes to wudu. And that's what he's referring to, the waswasa, where a person will be performing wudu for 30, 40, 50 minutes. Why? Because they assume that their wudu is not acceptable. They haven't perfected it. Where a person will feel like they've emitted something and go and check and realize they didn't, perform wudu, come back, start to pray again, and then feel like they've emitted something, go back. This happens. Where a person is afraid to use the bathroom because they're afraid of impurity splashing onto their body and their clothing. This happens. And he's saying this is not the way of the Shara. This is waswasa. This is from, as the whispers intrusive thoughts, whether from shaitan or from other external positions. And so we have to be balanced in our approach to tahara, in our approach to both tahara of the body and tahara of the heart and tahara of the soul. Then he says, الطرف الثاني المزال به وهو إما جامد وإما مائع. So he's spoken about that which we need to purify ourselves from. Now he's going to speak about that which is used to purify. He says it's إما جامد وإما مائع. So a person can either use that which is firm or that which is, like watery, liquid. He says, أما الجامد فحجر الاستنجاء. As for the jamid, that which we can use to clean ourselves, which is firm. He says, for example, rocks. And today we don't use rocks. I'm not sure if anyone prefers to use rocks, but I would assume the case is that no one uses rocks to clean themselves. Today we use tissue paper. But if a person were to go to a place where they have no access but to rocks, they can use rocks. There are conditions, etc. And that's where the fuqaha just will mention the conditions, etc. We're not going to go into it now. So a person would use whatever he has access to or she has access to, which meets the criteria set by the fuqaha, which basically he gives a short, brief sentence. He says, بشرط أن يكون صلبا طاهرا غير محترم, that it's firm and it removes impurities and it's pure and it's not something which has to be respected. So an example, a person will not be able to use a piece of glass, a smooth piece of glass. Why? Because it doesn't remove impurity, it will spread impurity. Number one. Number two, it's probably dangerous to do so. Likewise, a person wouldn't use a piece of paper that has some sort of writing on it, educational material, especially not if that educational material related to Islam. Why? Because it's something that we should respect. Likewise, a person wouldn't use food. Why? Because it's something which should be respected, etc. So then he says, أما المائعات فلا تزال النجاسات بشيء منها إلا الماء الطاهر. So as for that which is liquid, nothing from the liquids, no liquid can be used to purify the body, clothing, or place of prayer from impurities except for water. And that's according to the Shafi'i school. According to the Hanafi school, other than water can be used as long as it meets certain conditions, certain criteria, which to some extent he mentions anyway. The Ahnaf, they differentiate between purifying the body and purifying the clothing and place of prayer. As for the body, it has to be water. Water that has changed slightly is okay, even according to the Shafi'iyah. But as for clothing and place of prayer, basically any liquid which removes impurities and is pure itself, it's permissible to use. Yeah, but the Shafi'iyya, they say water for both instances. He says, الذي لم يتفاحش تغيره بمخالطة ما يستغني عنه. So it's permissible to use liquids, water, that is pure, so long as the water has not changed to a point where it's no longer water, basically. It can no longer be referred to as water. An example, if you were to ask someone, please bring me a cup of water, and they brought you a cup of diluted juice, so Vimto, Ribena, Robinson's orange squash, for example. Shandy. That's fizzy though, isn't it? So if they were to bring you one of these, you would say, I asked for water. You would say, I asked for water. But if they were to bring you something that perhaps, it's been mixed with, a hint of lemon, it would still be considered water. Why? Because the water hasn't changed so much so that it's not referred to as water anymore. Likewise, if you said, bring me a cup of warm water, and they brought you warm water with a tea bag in it, you would say, I asked for warm water, not tea. Why? Because the color change, the taste change, and tea doesn't really have a strong smell. But if you have, a sensitive nose and you can smell the difference, then those things indicate that it's no longer water. Whereas if a person were to bring you warm water and something that hasn't changed, the color or the taste has been added to the water, it wouldn't change the fact that it's warm water. So that's what he's saying basically. So long as the water hasn't changed so much so that the name is no longer water, it's changed to something else, then you can use it. And then he says ويخرج الماء عن الطهارة بأن يتغير بملاقاة النجاسة طعمه أو لونه أو ريحه. So as we mentioned, that water is no longer considered purifying of others, even though it may be pure in itself, if its taste, its color, or its smell has changed by something else. So if you've added something to water and the color, taste, or smell has changed, and that which you added was pure, the water remains pure, but it no longer purifies other things. Whereas if it's changed with something that is impure, the water becomes impure. So what's the difference? The difference is water that is unchanged by something else which is pure. Let's say, for example, diluted Vimto, water that is changed by something pure, diluted Vimto. If you compare it to water which has not been changed with something pure, it's just pure water, you can use that water for wudu, but you can't use the water that has Vimto in it for wudu. But you can use the water that has Vimto in it, for example, for cooking, if you wanted to. Might sound strange, but ruling-wise, it's still pure that you can consume it and you can cook with it, but it's not purifying that you can clean with it. According to some of the other fuqaha, such as the Ahnaf, it may even still be considered purifying of the clothing and the place of prayer. And that's it's a place of difference, but they're leading to the same place. Then he says, فإن لم يتغير وكان قريبا من قلتين لم ينجس لقوله عليه الصلاة والسلام إذا بلغ الماء قلتين لم يحمل خبثا. So if now the water has changed with something which is impure and it's less than قلتين, which is a large amount of water, the equivalent to I think a few hundred liters if I'm not mistaken, I forgot the exact number, but if water is lesser than this measurement, قلتين, so the Ahnaf, they say if it's 10 by 10 and a handspan in depth, so 10 arm lengths by 10 arm lengths and a handspan in depth, if water is lesser than that and impurity enters into the water immediately becomes impure, whether you can see a change or you can't see a change. But if the water reaches a large amount, then the water does not change by mixing with impurity unless you can see a change in the water. And again, it's fiqh related, so you look at it in more detail and go through the examples when studying fiqh. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا بَلَغَ الْمَاءُ قُلَّتَيْن لَمْ يَحْمَلْ خَبَثًا. So this is the hadith which is used by the Shafi'iyya and the Hanabila as well. الطرف الثالث في كيفية الإزالة. So he's spoken about that which is to be removed. He's spoken about that which removes. And now he's going to speak about how to remove. Remove what? Impurities. So he says النجاسة إن كانت حكمية وهي التي ليس لها جرم محسوس فيكفي إجراء الماء على جميع مواردها. So he says if the impurity is حكمية, so it's impure, the place is impure, you know it's impure, but it doesn't have a physical body to the impurity, then it's enough for you to basically run the water over all parts that were affected by the impurity. To keep it brief, he says وإذا كانت عينية أو وإن كانت عينية فلا بد من إزالة العين. As for if the impurity has a body, then you have to remove the body of the impurity in order for the place to be considered impure. So an example, if you have some blood on the carpet, you have to remove the body of the blood in order for the place to be considered pure. So long as the body of the blood is there, the place is considered impure. Yeah, regardless of what you spray it with and so on and so forth. He says, وَبَقَاءُ الطَّعْمِ يَدُلُّ عَلَى بَقَاءِ الْعَيْنِ وَكَذَا بَقَاءُ اللَّوْنِ. And if the taste of the impurity is still there, then it indicates that the impurity is still there. Likewise, the color. If the color of the impurity is still there, it indicates that the impurity is still there. Is that always the case? He's going to mention إلا فيما يلتصق فهو معفو عنه بعد الحت والقرص. Except for that which is sticky, it sticks. It's very difficult for you to remove. This is overlooked after you've tried to scratch at it and you've tried to squeeze it out, etc. If you've tried to scratch at it and squeeze it out, but you cannot get rid of it, then that which remains is considered to be overlooked. It doesn't become pure, but it's considered to be overlooked. He says, وَأَمَّا الرَّائِحَةُ فَلَا يُعْفَى عَنْهَا إِلَّا إِذَا عَسِرَ إِزَالَتُهَا. As for the smell, it's not considered to be overlooked except in that which is difficult to remove. So there are some impurities, if you clean the body of the impurity, the smell of the impurity goes with it. But there are some, even if you remove the body of the impurity, no matter how much you clean it, it's difficult to remove the smell. You have to give it some time for the smell to leave. An example might be vomit, for example. Vomit has a very distinct smell, and it can be difficult to remove the smell, even when you've scrubbed out the actual body of the impurity. So that would be overlooked. But generally speaking, the remnants of the smell is an indication that the impurity is still there, and so it needs to be cleaned. And the fuqaha, they discuss this, that there are slight differences of opinion in relation to this issue. Then he says, وَالْمُزِيلُ لِلْوَسْوَاسِ. If a person is affected by intrusive thoughts, whispers of shaitan, if a person is affected by these things, i.e. it's not clean yet, or you touch this is not clean, this is a common problem. And this is something which has increased generally in society since the COVID situation and lockdown, where people are afraid to touch things because they might be impure, or there might be germs there, bacteria there, etc. And it's affected Muslims within their worship, within their homes, and non-Muslims. He says that which will rid you of these types of thoughts, أن يعلم أن الأشياء خلقت طاهرة بيقين. To know that everything was created pure with certainty, i.e. to be certain that everything in its initial creation was created pure. So if you touch something, unless you have indication that this thing is impure, its asl is what? It's pure. If I touch a wall, if I cannot see physical impurity, then I should assume what? That it's pure. If I pray on a carpet, I should assume that it's pure. If I shake someone's hand, I assume that their hand is pure. If I come into contact with clothing, a new type of clothing, it's pure. Everything is to be considered pure, as long as there is nothing substantial to indicate that it's impure. And what's considered substantial in the Sharia? That which gives you certain knowledge of something. Anything else is to be disregarded. So I might say, for example, I might have a child, and my child is wearing a nappy, and they've urinated in a nappy, and they're running around the house, and I say, the child may have perhaps some of the urine spilt onto the child's leg and ran down onto the child's foot, and now the child may have put urine all over this place where I pray. Unless I've seen this happen, and I know with certainty that happened, then the asl, the default state is what? Purity. That the floor is pure, and that didn't happen. If a child comes and sits on my lap and they're wearing a nappy, and they get off and run away, I might say to myself, maybe the child left some impurity there that dried up and I didn't see it. If I don't see it, that means what? It's pure. Why? Because we go with that which is certain and we disregard that which is uncertain. And this is a cure, because for many of us, we suffer from these issues, intrusive thoughts, waswas, whispers of shaitan, etc. We suffer from these things. And so knowing this is a cure. And it's sometimes a cure to that which we don't know we would suffer from without having this cure. So bear that in mind. That al-aslu fil ashya al-tahara. That the original state of everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created is pure. Everything is to be considered pure unless otherwise stated by the Sharia. Yeah, I'll come back to inshallah. And then he says, فما لا يشاهد عليه نجاسة ولا يعلمها يقينا يصلي معه. So anything which has not been seen to have been affected by impurity, or it's not known with certainty that it's impure or it's been affected by impurity, is to be prayed with, to be prayed upon, and so on and so forth. And this is a real issue that's affected many of us as Muslims and non-Muslims generally. And with OCD, anxiety, things like this, we have a cure in our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because anxiety, OCD, a lot of it revolves around a lack of comfort with the unknown, with that which we don't have control over. And knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has control over all of our affairs. A person might develop health anxiety. They become anxious about becoming sick. Knowing that Allah is the one who writes sickness and writes health, you let go of that want to control the situation. Likewise, finance. A person might become anxious over their finance. You let go. Likewise, for example, a person who's looking to get married, they're taking the means and they can't find the spouse. You let go. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for everyone provided prior to their arrival on this earth. And your spouse is from your provision. And so the more you think about it, belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a cure for these things. So we'll conclude with that, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.